So agenda today, we have three loose topics we want to be covering. So how do you really build a scaling base? How do you really scale from zero to hero? And then touching kind of product-led growth, developer-centric marketing and sales, utilizing open source as really the vehicle to attain a lot of usage for your product. And then finally, because I know Neo4j has always been very special in how they've maintained their company culture, although the organization has been very much distributed and working from very many different places in the world, how to really manage and maintain the type of a culture that really carries the company forward. And finally, we have a Q&A session. And basically with that, Emil has built a company really from a 3-person startup to now over 100 million in ARR, raising the biggest ever funding round for a database company last year, almost $400 million in a funding round. With further ado, Emil, would you like to start by just a little intro of yourself and Neo4j, and then we dive right into the topics of today?
Sure, yeah. So great to be here. You didn't mention this, but with wearing a different hat, Sami co-led our seed back in 1776. Or something like that.
Gustav Vasa, I think, was ruling.
Yeah, it's like 1523 exactly. No, back in 2009, and so we worked together, for a long time. We've known each other for, it's not quite 15 years, but pretty close, at this point. Yeah, so my name is Emil Eifrem. I am currently dialing in from Malmö, where I now live. I lived in the Valley for 7 years. A few years after Sami invested, I moved there, but we started the company in Sweden. And we'll go much more into it, but the premise behind the company is very, very simple. In fact, today people might even call it simplistic, which is the observation that the world is becoming increasingly connected, which is hardly controversial statement on a two-way Zoom call with hundreds of participants and whatever from all over the world, possibly, right? So of course everything is becoming more connected, but so that's not very controversial. But a little bit more subtle though is, what's the consequence of that? Well, data models the real world. So as the world is becoming more connected, data is becoming more connected. And that exerts a huge amount of pressure on traditional databases. Storing connected data, like social networks is one way of thinking about it, right? Is very challenging in tabular databases. And we saw that and realized that, what if we could build a product that is optimized around connected data, right? And as we did that, and we coined the term graph databases, we'll go into the war stories later, but fast forward to today, Sami mentioned we crossed 100 million ARR, headquartered in the Valley, have the engineering team here in Europe. Most folks probably here in Malmö, Sweden, but tons of folks in London as well. We actually have multiple products on our platform right now. The core database is at the center of it, and developers use that to build applications. But we have a really exciting, fast-growing data science product as well, built on the same platform that provides relationships and data as a signal into machine learning. So it's very popular. We have the graph visualization tool, right, which is targeting yet another type of users. So it's an overall fairly comprehensive platform at this point. Growing fast, pre-IPO, all that good stuff, right? So we'll go into more details in particular about the early days, but that's kind of the high level stuff.
Yeah, very good. So let's dive into kind of building the scaling base, and maybe kind of starting from the, do you consider there having been like different stages in the Neo4j life cycle of was it always bound to a funding round, or how did you really like stage the company? Because I know you were always big about, this year you had certain team that you wanted to like, these are the things we want to accomplish under certain teams. But how did you how do you really like concretely see those staging and
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as with many things, it kind of emerges more clearly in hindsight. I'm like, okay, this
right.
was clear state, and this was a,
Yeah.
and in many ways, of course, it's the dark ages, the pre-Sami dark ages, and then the post-Sami,
Exactly.
light amazing age. Of
Yes,
course.
exactly.
Oh, of
Enlightened.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, so we built the product to solve a problem ourselves, right? And so we ran into the problem, at my first startup that I didn't start, but here in Sweden, building media asset management, enterprise content management, solutions. It was actually a SaaS service way before the SaaS term. It was called ASP at the time,
Yeah.
right? In the first IT bubble, application service provider.
Yeah.
And so we built that. I was not a founder, but I was a CTO. So I got kind of stuck with choosing the technology architecture. And, we ran into the problem of, we had an engineering team of about 20 people. Half of them just kept banging their heads against the proverbial wall and fighting against the database. And we didn't really understand why, but after a long time kind of thinking about it, we realized that there was this mismatch between the shape of the data, right? The data was very connected. Files that belong to folders that belong to other folders, right? So very connected data set that we tried to squeeze into square and static tables. So that was the kind of the spark, the origin that got this itch that we wanted to scratch ourselves and solve it for ourselves. So that is clearly the first stage, is kind of the pre-product, where we built what today, honestly, I would think of as the product MVP. And this is before even the term MVP was coined, right? It was coined by actually our advisor, if you remember, Sami, Eric Ries of Lean Startup fame. He coined the term MVP, but that's how I would think about kind of the first, probably up to 2007, 2008, something like that. We co-developed the product with a few close users, not even customers, really. Yeah. We ourselves, we were one.
Wait, they weren't customers. I used them as reference.
Yes, sure, Sami. Yes, they were customers. And so we were one of them, which is great. One of the things that that ends up emerging for me as a key high order bit for success for early stage founder teams is user empathy, even more so than customer empathy. Sometimes the user and the customer is the same, right? Frequently in enterprise sales, right? It's multiple stakes people that you end up selling into, right? And so the actual user might or might not be the economic buyer, right? But that empathy for the user, right? We excelled at because the user was us. And it's very easy to have empathy for yourself. In fact, the definition of empathy
is the pain, and then you found the same pain with other people around
with
you.
other people, right? Exactly, right? So I would say that's kind of the first stage, getting to that product MVP together with a few kind of close users and customers.
Yeah. And then I remember the early days of really starting to sell, starting to try to sell.
Yeah.
How do you see the next leap from that? I mean, we have some very early customers in the Valley, some early customers in Europe. So how do you kind of?
Yeah, I think the next stage for me is the and maybe if we kind of latch onto the funding round. So we raised the seed round in fall of 2009, right? And then we raised the Series A in summer of 2011, right? and so if you think of kind of that, maybe 2007 when we formed the company until the Series A, those 4 years, what I feel like is kind of the thematic focus of that era was getting the product from that product MVP, worked really well, solved a real problem, like an antibiotics level problem, but for a very small number of a handful, like 2, 3, 4 customers, right? In a generic way, but still, like, you'd have to be very much an expert on what we had built in order to be able to get value from it, right? And in the years leading up to the Series A, that was very much focused on, right now, how can we get that to GA? Like, so a generic developer out there can hear about us somehow, and maybe we'll talk more about that later, how even they could hear about it, right? But, and then go to our site, download us, we were open source, right? Even back then. And then get up and running themselves. So that's a huge amount of kind of product surface and API work, and make sure we're not kind of custom built to underlying weird platforms. stuff like that. There's a huge amount of documentation work too, right?
Yeah.
And so there's an entire product game there. And then there's what I would call kind of the seeds of a community
product was
game.
really like almost like an embedded, like most early users were really truly embedding the database rather than using it as a server. So taking that and really productizing it to another level. Yeah.
Exactly, becoming a server component, right? So you can connect to it. And the name of the company back then was Neo Technology, but already the community was Neo4j. And there's an entire backstory to that. When we always called it Neo because I was a fan of the Matrix movies and stuff like that. But Neo.com was ridiculously expensive. It was all of $2,000. which we couldn't afford, back in whatever 2007, and so we added 4J onto it, which was $9, which we could afford barely, but we could afford. And so we had kind of that seed of a community. So I think that's the second stream, kind of getting the product to GA. The first stream. Second stream would be kind of seeding that community, which is very much a door-to-door kind of blocking and tackling. Not fancy. It was winning over one person by one person by one person, type of a thing in the early days, right? So that I think would be kind of the second stream. And then I think the third stream would be some version of category creation, right? And we coined the term graph database, which was like a step function change for us, and was able to take that concept and latch that onto NoSQL.
Right.
Because mid of 2009, NoSQL was coined, and maybe people, like, depends on kind of the age of the founders, who are dialing in. People might not even remember it. I don't even know if people talk about it anymore. But that was kind of the moniker, the shouting word, for this alternative point of view on databases. Any database that was not a relational, traditional, kind of sold by Oracle type database, kind of this umbrella term NoSQL was formed in summer of 2009. And a huge part of our game was not just establishing graph databases as a category, but make sure that it was considered part of the broader NoSQL umbrella.
Yeah, and certainly that NoSQL in a way helped you as an early, fairly small company still to leverage a lot of marketing money that others in that NoSQL group were actually deploying on the market. But any tricks? How were you able to actually push yourself to be the fourth leg of that, NoSQL kind of a four-legged monster?
Yeah, there's a lot in this story that I'll come back to luck. This one, I think, was honest to pure skill. I think we had clarity of thinking here, and we executed the hell out of that one. Right? We saw NoSQL happening, and the ironic thing is that it was a one-day conference organized actually by a fellow Swede, Johan Oskarsson, who worked at Last FM and then a couple other companies in the Valley, organized a one-day meetup. Happened to call it NoSQL, right? Some journalist was there from like Information Week or some big media outlet, and wrote an article called NoSQL, kicking Oracle's ass, or something like that, and it just blew up. It just exploded, and we looked at that and said, "Holy shit!" Like, for whatever it's worth, we've been working for several years now on this really hard problem. I don't know how technical you want this to be, but we're building like an ACID transactional database kernel. There's only maybe a handful to 10 organizations on the planet that have been able to pull that off technically at the time, right? Yeah. So we built that, and now then this NoSQL thing was happening, and we were unable to go there because we were invited to go there, but we couldn't because we couldn't afford the plane tickets to fly over. Right? So in summer of 2009, this is pre-erasing the
I remember.
Right? And so we couldn't do that, right? But then, once we landed the funding, there's like a second conference being thrown called NoSQL East in Atlanta. And this is just when our funding round came together. And we flew over there, And I decided to, so there's like 8 speakers, each from a different database project. This is like, maybe there's 2 or 3 companies around, but like startups being with funding, but like 8 to 10 projects who gave a talk. We were one of them. I had 50 minutes. I dedicated 35 to 40 minutes of that to just talking about the broader space, not about graph databases, certainly not about Neo4j, right? I talked about what the hell is NoSQL, because it turned out that there were, I don't know, 30, 40 different database projects. But after you started looking at them deeply and studying them, like a taxonomy emerged, right? And it was, okay, actually there's a bucket over here called key value stores. There's a bucket called column family and document store. And then we have graph databases. And the entire reason that I made that, and I talked about that terminology, which then ended up being established 10 years later. I read Gartner reports with those 4 categories, right? Yeah. The only reason I did that was so that when people listed NoSQL companies or NoSQL projects, graph databases would be one of them. And so attaching ourselves to that broader moniker, that broader movement, ended up being very much a step function change. And again, I'm going to be like super candid about how lucky we've been and serendipity. I think this one was honestly clarity of thinking, and we executed pretty well on it.
Of course, that was seeding the creation of a whole new database category, not just the NoSQL, but within NoSQL, the graph databases that really didn't really existed, before that. So
exactly right, and then I did a couple of in the self-congratulatory part, and then I'll dial that back. I promise, but like I did a couple of talks talking about kind of the 10 years later, what's going to happen, talking about, hey, there's going to be like 4 companies emerging, and because that's what happened in the SQL world in the 80s, right? And so some talks about that. And it's funny, right? As we crossed into this decade, so 10 years after SQL was formed, right? There's 5 companies now out of the 350 database projects on dbengines.com, 350, right? 5 companies have crossed 100 million ARR. It's Mongo, of course, actually, who this quarter crossed 1 billion ARR. Amazing success. And then there's Redis and Neo4j, who are in exactly that path. Like you start looking into their financials, exactly that path. And then there's Couchbase and DataStax, who crossed 100 million ARR, but who plateaued a little bit and not growing all that fast. And they're high quality companies, and they can still turn it around, but it's more of a turnaround situation, at this point.
Now that you mention, maybe we'll attack it from this point of view. So how do you kind of, let's go back to some of the early days. So what are some of the things that you knowingly put in place in order to ensure that you were able to scale, I don't know, from 0 to 1 to 10, and now maybe 10 to 100. So there's sometimes there are like clear things, and I know you worked with the organization quite a lot lately on making sure that now with huge amount of funding, you can really scale the organization and still keep things under control. But maybe if we backpedal to some of the early days, like what were some of the things you did in order to really ensure that there aren't major hiccups when going out and hiring a lot of people and so forth?
Well, first of all, there were always major hiccups. So the question is only like, how do you manage them, right? But
what? So not just unicorns and lollipops.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of crazy. So I would say a couple of things coming back to the early days, and there's a ton of kind of $10 to $100 million. If we think about kind of the revenue brackets, right? Learnings too, but if I think about kind of the 0 to 1 to 10, kind of those early days, there's several things that emerge, and I'll say up front that everything looks so much more obvious in hindsight, right? And you were there.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, exactly.
We want to deliver this to guys that are building this right now, so that maybe they don't have to look at it in hindsight. Yep.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things, right? So one is I mentioned that kind of building the product MVP, right? we did it very, very closely with a small number of users and customers, right? And we ourselves were one of them, right? And that I think is super crucial to make sure that there's a real, true kind of a real world problem that you're solving in ways that the end user actually how they think about it. But there's a counterbalance there, which is you must make sure you don't become too custom and too bespoke. And we were pretty good in the early days to not commit to features for specific customers.
Yeah.
And probably could have monetized faster, earlier, bigger singular deal sizes if we'd done more of a bespoke feature for that one big customer. But then if that feature was not repeatable across the customer base, it was not even up for negotiation. We just didn't do it. Like we were very Puritan, from that perspective, and that I think was an important part of it. I think the other piece is if you think about kind of where we are today, the 100 million that we've announced that we've crossed, 85% of that, in fact more than 85% of our ARR started with an individual technical champion. So building that community of users is not like a sideshow for us. It is not something that we do because it's good strategically as moat against the cloud platforms. It is good strategically. It's good moat against the cloud platforms. But it's not just that. It is also how we make money in the short term, right? So getting that alignment, short-term and long-term alignment on the go-to-market is super powerful, right? And now we, as you probably recall, Sami, like we also combine that with a couple of anchor accounts that we got just through knocking on doors, opening up kind of our, hey, here's what a graph database is, how are you, and so on and so forth. It's funny, I was on a call yesterday with a guy called Jay Parikh, who it was the global VP engineering at Facebook up until 9 months ago. And now I was the co-CEO of a security company called Lacework. And we were talking about the first time he and I met was when he was VP engineering and CTO. Actually, Mark Andreessen was the CTO. He was VP engineering of a company called Ning, which no one remembers today. It was Mark Andreessen's third or fourth company after Netscape and a few others. And I first met him back in April of 2009, and that was an example of a lighthouse reference account that we tried to get. We ended up not getting them, but where I met him at a conference, I said, hey, check out my coach. I'm going to open it up. Here's like all the amazing specs for a graph database, and tried to convince him, right? And we had that conversation, right? So we won a few accounts that way to serve as kind of examples and lighthouse accounts. But most of the go-to-market happened through that first kind of building the community and then inbound, right? So I think that was really powerful. We didn't try to just chase some short-term ARR, which then would peter out and plateau over time. So I think that's the second piece. And then the third one, back in 2011, I hired ultimately what ended up becoming my COO. That's not what I was looking for, right? We got some early customers, and you recall this, Sami. I was the sales rep for them, and a really lousy one. I'm good at opening doors, right? I get really excited about understanding what the customer's problems are, and is there a way for us to fit in? And I'm authentically super passionate about what we do, right? And so I'm good at opening the door, but once I figure out where it should fit, I've convinced the customers, together we realize that it's a good fit, right? The customers start using us, and it goes to kind of like paperwork and procurement and negotiating deal size. I know intellectually that that's important, but then I'm kind of bored. Right, and I'm much more likely to spend time on opening the next door, right? And so after a while, Sami, you would remember this, but for the audience, we conclude like we need like sales, like this, like a real sales machinery here, right?
I think over the years I have not seen you guys do mishires too many times, but we did do some early
Yes.
misfires on the sales.
Yes.
Because we hired, high pressure US style sales guys, and we didn't have a product that they could run with truly.
Yes.
At the early stage, you need to really, twist and turn it a little bit and really listen to the customer, like you said, in order to make that sale. And a standard, US sales guy is not doing that. So we needed something better, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. So we had a few, so we realized, okay, it can't be Emil being the sales guy, right? That's not working. All right.
You realized that on the board.
I'm sure you realized that way before I realized that, right? And so, okay, so then we had a few attempts, a few mishires that didn't really work out for a variety of reasons and so on and so forth. And then bumped into Lars, right? And so Lars Nordwall, Silicon Valley guy for 20 years, but with a suspiciously Nordic name. Wait, yeah. Lars Nordwall? Is it Lars Nordwall? Or is it Lars Nordvall? Well, it turned out it was Lars Nordvall, but as someone described to me, he's the most Americanized Swede you'll ever meet. And so we had this really strong go-to-market background where I obviously came at it from a product and end user perspective, right? The four legs on my stool tend to be kind of product, people, market, and strategy, right? And he's this really strong go-to-market sales executive who done that before and a little bit unusually also in open source. So he'd been at a company called Sugar CRM, which is open source CRM, like a Salesforce competitor, and then a company called Pentao, which is open source BI, right? It was very much in the data space, right? And we met and just completely hit it off, right? And it was very much kind of a yin yang kind of work, husband, wife, if I'm allowed to use that in 2022, or husband, whatever modern form of relationship you want to be, right? It's just this really good complementarity there, right? And I hired him and trusted him and gave him a really, really long leash, right? Like, so basically, look, you run the go-to-market. I am an intrinsically curious person. I can go down on a detail level on comp plans and stuff like that, just because I'm curious about my own company, right? So in terms of strategy, even go-to-market strategy, I want to be involved. In terms of running it, go crazy. Don't do something too crazy, but like just go with it, right? And I think that was the third one in terms of trying to build a foundation, a scalable foundation, for the long run.
Yeah. Maybe we'll kind of you already touched it a little bit, but you as you said, Neo has always been an open source company. It's really in the core of the company, and again, committing to that means that you certainly defer some part of your revenue, but then it comes back stronger, over the time because you're not pushing it. So it kind of ties back to the SaaS term of product-led growth, delivering a lot of early value and only capturing the business when the customer is really right. But maybe you can dive into that a little bit deeper. You're still deploying the same strategy today. How are you today commercializing? Does the open source, those single engineers wanting to test the database, utilize the database, are you leading those? Are you feeding those into your lead engine? How do you convert today?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, and I agree. I think on some level, open source is PLG for kind of B2D on-prem startups, as a business to developer. So developer go to market, kind of on-prem startups, right? Like open source is PLG for that. Why? Because what it gives you is this ability for your actual the users of your product to self-onboard onto your product, right? Just through documentation, through forums and stuff like that, and get up and running and self-activate, right? Which is really the key motion in PLG, getting them up and running. Mm-hmm. And then later on after that, you can usually, people say you can usually monetize. There's a number of things to fall off a cliff and die in open source. Still in SaaS, yes, though less so, because you just have so many more levers to pull on in terms of instrumentation. With open source, it's basically licensing and feature differentiation. Those are really your only knobs. But to answer your question, that is how we monetize, right? And we went through that entire motion, right, where we created an open source community edition, right, and then we put certain key features into our enterprise edition. So, for example, clustering, which ended up being a fairly contrarian point of view. If you look at our generation of open source, I don't know of a single example of a company that put clustering into the commercial edition. Everyone puts clustering into their community edition. The consequence of putting clustering into your community edition, it's a feature that is basically required if you're in production. And I'm not sure how technical the audience is, but like if you're a database, you're being used in production, like you want to run across multiple machines, because anytime, but especially in a cloudy world, like machines go up and down, and you don't want your entire system to fall apart if the machine that happens to run your database falls over. Like, so whenever you put something that is valuable in production, you need clustering, right? And so if you put that in your community edition, what that means is you're going to get more adoption, but you're going to convert less, right? Compared to if you put clustering in enterprise edition. We ended up putting clustering in enterprise edition because we felt that, look, I'm a open source guy, I love community, card carrying member of the open source, all of that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. At the end of the day, though, the long-term arc of a database company is going to be controlled by its ability to monetize, in particular, monetize the Global 2000. You look at any database company, and 80% of the revenues from the Global 2000, yeah. Right? And so, like, do I really want to give that all away just to kind of scorch the earth, right? And so that was kind of my thinking. Reflecting back on it, it's high on my list for candidates of my biggest mistakes, because the consequence of that, right, is that our community then will be relatively smaller, because the community edition that you get for free is less valuable, right? If you go to a Mongo or a Couchbase, which is called CouchDB at the time, or just any alternative, you would get more for free. So naturally, you're going to get more people there, right? And when you choose category creation, which is a go-to-market, is an aspect of our go-to-market that we haven't really touched on too much, but category creation, by definition, no one knows how big the market is because you're creating it, right? And we have this funky name, like the name of our company is completely funky, Neo4j, but like even the name of the category, graph database, it sounds like very mathy and obscure, and like how many truly need a graph database? Isn't it just for the big social networks, that type of a thing? So that was very much the talk of the town in the Valley for many years. Yeah. And then if you take that intrinsic component of our go-to-market strategy, category creation, and you combine that with this particular choice of monetization, where we put clustering over here, which increased conversion, but meant that the community was smaller. If you combine that and you think about, all right, Sandhill VCs, any VCs, even Vendep, any VCs will pattern match on open source. And they would say that, look, if you have a big community, that's an early leading indicator for this becoming big.
Eventually it converts. Yeah.
Exactly. We had kind of artificially constrained the size and growth of our community because we wanted to increase conversion rate. But then if you already had this kind of, wait, how big can this be? Because this is a new category, unlike something like MySQL that was open source for an existing massive category, right? Yeah. You add those two together, and this ended up being almost the kiss of death for the company, right? Where it's very hard to convince people how big this was going to become. And I know I'm like in a long monologue here, but just to kind of wrap up this piece of it, right? And my ability to whiteboard, I pride myself on being a fairly good whiteboarder, right? And have an ability to kind of articulate where I believe the world is going and all that kind of stuff, right? Was still not strong enough to win over kind of that big, massive check size, right? The likes of which that Mongo was able to do because they had that big adoption, right? Until my metrics showed up, right? And if you look at whatever, let's pick apart the last, like whatever, 2 billion plus, we haven't announced the exact valuation, but over $2 billion valuation, you know, Google Ventures, Eurazeo, Patrick Pichette, the chairman of Twitter, you know, at the time, and CFO of Google joining the board. Like that kind of stuff happened when my whiteboarding could be matched up by metrics, but it was really revenue metrics. It's those types of metrics, not kind of that early community metrics, which were always very good and sizable for us, just not on the scale of a MySQL or a Mongo.
Yeah, but I mean, looking back, I think also VC's appetite has changed over the years from like pure open source to different models, and of course now a lot of open source. And this is maybe our road into Aura, but like I think many companies today have open source in the core, and then they monetize with a SaaS service. So so you guys also launched your SaaS database Aura, I guess about a year ago. Maybe we'll dive into that a little bit. What did it mean to the company? What changes did you have to, you know, did you make? How did you bootstrap it? And how do you see the future of the company now with both SaaS product and then kind of an on-prem product?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just one comment on what you said. I think that's spot on, that kind of the view, and it's maybe the VC view, but I think it's just the broader industry understanding around how to build these types of kind of deep infrastructure companies that are practitioner led in their go-to-market, right? And I painted kind of our journey and some of the drawbacks that I see with our journey, right? And I said, this is possibly a candidate for one of my biggest mistakes, right? On the flip side, I can rattle off tens of companies that looked amazing, had all the funding from the top tier VC, you know, that kind of stuff, right? But put too much in the open source, were never able to monetize and failed, right? And so it's very hard to run the counterfactual, right? But I think you're right. Kind of segueing into your question, I think there's a pretty clear blueprint emerging here, right? Like obviously, kind of cloud first companies is where it is, and if I were to start a company today, I do it cloud first, but I would not do it cloud only. If it's a developer tool, kind of my joking way to summarize that is like kind of enterprises run on data centers, both kind of private and public cloud data centers, but developers run on laptops, right? Like when you want to like, you know, you want to build shit, like you want to have a local, quick, iterative, you know, type of a thing, right? And even the big cloud platforms like the Amazons and the whatnot of the world, like are producing ultimately kind of software that they ship in an on-prem form factor, right? So
kind of the beauty of Docker and containers and whatnot. You can just build it all on your laptop and then go and deploy it.
Exactly, right? But so being cloud only is, for our type of software, is not the right thing to do. Not now, not ever, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now. So I think we're looking at a hybrid model for all of our, for Mongo, for Elastic, for Confluent. Choose your escape velocity kind of data-centric infrastructure company. That's what it looks like. Now, the emphasis ends up being different. Again, if I started from scratch today, I wouldn't first build on-prem, monetize that, and then shift to cloud. Of course not, right? But you have to have the balance. And for us, kind of the way that we thought about it was that on some level, if you think about kind of where we were 3-4 years ago, right? If you took stock of where we were, you know, when the shift to the cloud happened in the data layer of the stack, because the data layer of the stack was held back, you know, ironically, applications and VMs shifted first to the cloud, right? Like whatever, Hotmail, Gmail, Salesforce, you know, it's the application layer of the stack. And then the infrastructure layer with VMs, that shifted first, right? But the data layer was held back for many years because of things like data gravity and compliance and regulatory reasons and things like that. But in 2018, it really took off. It took off with, we learned then, there were still internal numbers at the time, but that AWS, the fastest growing, most profitable parts of AWS was the database products, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure the same is true for GCP, and Azure and Atlas from Mongo was just taking off, right? That was 2018. But it became very clear that, okay, everyone knew that this was where it was going to go, but it was very clear that that's when it happened, right? And so if you took stock of where we were, the way we thought about it is that on some level, we've solved the hardest problems, right? Like, we created the category, we've gotten massive awareness, right? Which was very targeted to developers, but really developers everywhere, right? Developers in any geography, developers at any size of company, developers any kind of, wherever they are in their professional journey, anyway, from student to like super senior, right, engineering leader type of thing, but focused on developers.
Right.
And then we've taken a thin slice of that and monetized that. And it was like, if you're global 2000, which by the way, at some point, we're going to run out of time. We could talk about it was not a pivot, but like a key inflection point was when we ended up focusing on the enterprise. But that thin slice is, you sit inside, your developer inside of the enterprise, right? So global 2000 in North America and Europe, in a country where we had sales coverage, where we had salespeople, solving a problem inside of a project that had access to hundreds of thousands of dollars, because that's our landing kind of price point, right? And so that's a very thin slice of all that awareness. And so we figured, okay, so we've solved kind of the bottom up kind of developer adoption thing. We've solved monetization at the high end, right? With the cloud form factor, now we can close the gap. And so that was kind of the rationale behind ultimately, how and when and why we built Aura.
And if we go to the organization, how has the organization changed, and where do you see this leading? I know that your cloud service is growing super fast right now, but like, where do you think this will take you as a company? Yeah.
So again, I don't believe it's going to be ever 100% kind of SaaS and 0% on-prem. But man, it's going to be pretty close. It's going to be whatever 80, 90%. At some point, right? And we started out by incubating this when it was purely an engineering project. It was a separate engineering team, on some level like a customer of our on-prem product, right? And there's some nuance here, right? Like we're not. There are some companies that when they shift to the cloud, they have to rewrite their entire product, right? Maybe they were like a web app written in Flash, and right, like you can't be that. So you have to rewrite that for modern HTML, for example, right? Then you have to throw your entire code base away and replace that, right? Or you have to shift from some programming language to a new one, something like that. That's not at all what we're doing. We're writing a platform, a new way of delivering the same product, right? And so that was very good. So we organized an engineering team dedicated. On some level, it was just another customer of our on-prem product, right? And that's kind of how it worked in the early days. Fast forward to today, when we're GA, we're available on AWS, on GCP. We have a bunch of different tiers, and thousands of customers, and like you said, growing mind-blowingly fast right now. It's a fully integrated engineering team, right? There's no difference between kind of the Aura engineering team and the current database kernel, and they're just two different teams as part of the same broader engineering org. And then we've gone through kind of we are going through like a similar thing on the go-to-market as well, which we can go into if you're interested.
Yeah. I was thinking that, so maybe that's too specific. Let's not go there. Let's actually, we have 10 minutes to go. So let's at this point touch a little bit the company culture at Neo4j. You can please do maybe describe some of your principles. But I mean, like early years, I remember going to your office, and there was Skype channel open to London office, to California office. So trying to really bring the people together the way a lot of companies have now tried to bring people together only over the past 2 years when they're forced to, but Neo already early on tried to like really bring everybody together and really have that feeling of we are one company. But some tricks and tips and whatnot, how have you done that at different stages, and now that I don't know how much are you, like 1,000 people, how do you still manage the culture and drive the culture in the company?
It's one of those things where there's so many skins that you have to kind of get rid of and grow new as a CEO. Culture is always going to be there. It's kind of like first team principles for your management team. Like that has to always be one of your top 3 priorities as a CEO, right? Because the moment you look elsewhere, it falls apart,
lose it.
right? That's just, and it's the same with culture. So it's in no way something that we solved, and there's a bunch of stuff that's broken with our culture and like all that kind of stuff. That's because it's human beings, right? And except for you and me, other human beings are flawed creatures.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. But we invested a lot in this, as you know, in the early days, and I tend to think of it like specifically the remote part, right? Growing up here in Sweden, right? Like I always felt that this was a Valley company, right? Because such deep infrastructure, developer go-to-market. I think today, and this sounds self-serving, it sounds like you planted it, but I think today you can raise from really clueful VCs in Scandinavia, in Europe. You can find really strong operators who've done that before, even with developer-facing companies, and you can find advisors and coaches and executives and things like that. 15 years ago, there was much more of that in the Valley. So just always felt like that's the soup we should swim in. Having said that, we felt that we could hire amazing engineers in Scandinavia and in Europe broadly. And people always think it's because they're cheaper than the Valley. They are cheaper than the Valley, much cheaper than the Valley. But that was never, like, I don't think not a single board meeting you ever heard me have that as an argument. It was just, we were much more differentiated here. Like we could hire the best, find and hire the best and the brightest, wanted to work on really amazing infrastructure, right? The likes of which you could only find inside the Googleplex, right? Facebook and that kind of stuff, right? Whereas in Europe, we were much more of a unique, differentiated and employer, right? But that meant that we had to deal with from almost day 1.1, having a distributed organization. And it's exactly what you said. We were early on, we went through all the motions and the pain of what today, honestly, is a lot easier because we had Skype. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Skype. Let's just take that.
There was nothing but Skype back in the day.
It was that's what existed, right? And it had super silly consequences. Like, so basically, so we have Skype open in the Valley, and then we have Skype open in Malmö and in London, right? And you could wave to each other or whatever. And then like you want to do all hands calls. And so then how do you do that? Well, you start a Skype channel. That's really what you do, right? Which is like a Skype group. And how does that work? Well, you add someone to that Skype group. It turns out you couldn't remove them. Like people, there's no like company. So people had their own personal Skype IDs.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when people left the company,
they were still on the channel.
They were still on that thing. And there was nothing you do other than recreating it every time, which was a pain. And so like, the tools have become a lot better since then. But anyways, so we went through a lot of kind of the motions of understanding, like we have to write things down. Like we articulated our core values. I have a coffee cup here, which says, we welcome intellectually honest discussions, except it's written with a cipher, our Korean language, because we're geeky. It was one of our 6 core values. We welcome intellectually honest discussions, and we were very early at writing them down, understanding that, holy crap, right? Like we're so distributed, and it took quite a while before I realized that, wait, even though we're 50 people, everyone hasn't met everyone, and but they probably never will, right? Even though we invested in like flying in everyone to the same location and stuff like that, it could take 9 months or a year, right? And so did a lot of kind of proactive work in things like that in the early days.
Yeah. Looking at the clock, I mean, as the audience can tell, we could keep going forever here, but I'm actually thinking about speaking some of the questions.
Yeah, we should answer some audience
here. So actually, this is really good from Liam. So how did you get your first 3 customers, and how long did it really take?
Yeah, I mean, it's back to kind of what we were joking about before, like customers, users. I think for me, the real one was people who built an application on Neo4j for production use.
Yeah.
If you think of that as customer, then whether they paid us, that's important, but less important. Kind of step one was that part, right? And that was very much a knocking on the door through our own social graph, people that we knew, right? As I mean, I started this out of college, right? And so I happened to be active with kind of the CIO of my university, and they were kicking off a project to do some, I don't even remember what the project was for, like managing classes and teachers and professors connected to the
I remember
classes, and which student belonged to which, and who's the TA in what. It's a graph, right?
Yeah.
And so we said, hey, we can build it for you, but then we're going to build it on this new product that we're investigating, that we're inventing, right? And so it was very much kind of through that network, right? And our first US customer was someone who was like a researcher out of Los Alamos National Laboratory, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Lanel, who was researching graph algorithms and stuff like that, right? And then he founded a startup based on that. Today, this would be called like a machine learning startup. And he needed a back end. We'd connected talking about shit like that. And when they raised money, they wrote our first, our first US check was from them, right? So it was very much kind of ad hoc, hand-to-hand combat, like one by one, right? And I think that is how you win in the early days. And then there was some kind of switch that I don't remember, but at some point, like there was the first customers that we didn't proactively kind of find, but had found us because people blogged about no-SQL, or they found one of the blogs we did, or something like that. And then you could start gleaning the early parts of an actual repeatable motion.
I guess one of the very early customers from San Jose is probably one of those that they just.
That's right.
Just the light went off. Yeah, craft. This should actually fit in some of our networking models and whatnot.
Yeah. You can probably say that. You can say that. I'll give you permission to say the name. So that was Cisco, right? And it was our first Fortune 500 customer. It was a big deal.
Very early. They were really early.
Yeah. What do you think? 2010 maybe, or something like that.
Yeah.
Lars closed the deal though, so I think we collected the cash in 2011. But that means the project
was. I went to see them with you. It was just two.
Yeah, exactly. So he wasn't there when it started, but
he closed it.
I think he closed it.
He couldn't, so he closed it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This is probably a good ending for the session. So you've asked this already in a couple points, but what were maybe some of the mistakes? If you start over, what would you not do? On top of that, whether clustering is open source or enterprise, but
so I'll abstract that one out. So I said that it's a top candidate. Is it a mistake? Is it not? Hard to run the counterfactual. What I am convinced about is a mistake and was a mistake, and in fact is the biggest mistake that I've done is, and I'll abstract this out, right? So our go-to-market, I hope it's become clear here, was win the hearts and minds of developers initially, and now data scientists, but I'm talking about the early days. Win the hearts and minds of of the developer, right? Teach them when graph databases and Neo4j is a good fit, right? And then the next day or week or month or year, they would wake up at their day job, right? Which is at Bank of America or Verizon or Cisco or some big enterprise, realize that, wait, the reason we're struggling in my project is because the database is holding us back. And that thing that I played around with in weekends and evenings, Neo4j, maybe that would be a good fit. Then they pick up the phone and call us, and a sales cycle begins. That's how we go to market, right? So that's the strategy. The way that I resourced the company from 2011 and onwards was not aligned with that strategy. Because when Lars joined, he was employee number 14. There was like 10 engineers, me, some admin and whatever, and then Lars joined, right? So that was it.
We didn't even have marketing at that.
Exactly. A year later, we were 50 people and still a dozen engineers.
Yeah.
And that may not be the wrong organization, but that's the organization required to do more of a classic enterprise sales top-down go-to-market motion. So that's not necessarily the wrong go-to-market motion, right? And the more practitioner first go-to-market is not necessarily the right one. But what is wrong is having this as a strategy and resource the company for the other strategy. That mismatch between strategy and resourcing is the biggest mistake that I made.
Right. And I guess, those were early years, but I think the positions such as customer advocates and all different types of customer success engineers and whatnot have actually surfaced after that time.
Yes, that's right.
And are today just an obvious part of the early organizations.
Yes, I think that's right.
Very good. We are unfortunately running out of time, so we need to continue this.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Exactly. At another time. So as everybody maybe have become aware, this is recorded, so we will post that to everybody later on, so that you can enjoy this again and share with your friends. Emil, sincere thanks. Was super fun, very insightful. Very, very happy to have had this discussion with you and share it with the guys online. With
Always
that,
a pleasure, Sami.
big thanks. All right.
Always a pleasure. Thanks everyone. Thanks for paying in.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.